Imagine a world lit only by firelight and ambition. The year is 1812. The United States of America, a fledgling nation, barely 30 years old, is still finding its footing on the world stage. The ink on the Declaration of Independence has hardly dried, and the echoes of revolutionary cannons have only just faded into memory. For many, the dream of liberty, fought for with so much blood and sacrifice, feels both incredibly real and terrifyingly fragile. Across the vast Atlantic, the old world power, Great Britain, watches with a skeptical eye. The wounds from their defeat in the American Revolution are still raw. Though peace was declared, a deep-seated tension simmers just beneath the surface. It's a tension felt in every port, on every trade route, and in the heart of every American sailor. The British Empire, a global juggernaut with the most powerful navy the world has ever known, isn't quite finished with its former colony. On the high seas, British warships patrolled with an arrogant swagger. They stop American merchant vessels, not just to inspect their cargo, but to seize sailors, citing a desperate need for manpower in their ongoing war against Napoleon's France. They claim many of these American seamen are actually British deserters. This practice, known as impressment, is a deep and constant insult to American sovereignty. Imagine a citizen of a free country, snatched from their ship and forced to serve under a foreign flag they once fought to escape. Each incident is a spark, fanning the flames of resentment and outrage back home. But the friction isn't just happening on the water. To the west, on the wild and untamed frontier, another conflict is brewing. American settlers, driven by a belief in their manifest destiny, are pushing ever westward into lands inhabited for centuries by Native American tribes. Tensions are escalating into violent clashes. From the shadows, British agents in Canada are providing weapons and encouragement to tribal confederacies, hoping to create a buffer state that would halt American expansion and protect their own interests. Leaders like the great Shawnee chief, Tecumseh, see an alliance with the British as their best hope to preserve their way of life and resist the relentless American advance. The frontier is becoming a powder keg, and the British are holding the match. Back in Washington, the young capital city, the halls of Congress ring with heated debate. A new generation of politicians, the Warhawks, led by fiery figures like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, are tired of what they see as national humiliation. They are not the old revolutionaries who personally knew the cost of war. They are young, proud, and fiercely nationalistic. They argue that America's honor, its economic survival, and its future as a legitimate nation are on the line. They pound their fists and demand action, their voices rising in a crescendo for a second war of independence. They believe another fight is necessary to finally sever the remaining ties of colonial submission and command the world as respect. Meanwhile, President James Madison, one of the nation's founding fathers and the architect of the Constitution, finds himself in an impossible position. He is a man of intellect and reason, not a man of war. He has tried diplomacy, embargoes, and every peaceful measure he can conceive to protect American interests. Yet, the insults and injuries continue to mount. The pressure from the Warhawks is immense, the public's anger is palpable, and the nation's pride is hanging by a thread. He is facing the monumental decision of whether to lead his young, unprepared country into a conflict against the mightiest empire on earth. This isn't just a dispute over sailors or territory. It's a profound test of the American experiment itself. Can this republic, founded on the radical idea of government by the people, actually defend itself? Can it stand up to the old monarchies of Europe and prove it is not a fleeting fantasy, but a permanent and powerful force in the world? A storm is gathering. The calm before is deceptive. For on the horizon, the clouds of war are darkening, and the thunder of cannons will soon roll across the land and sea once more. The nation is about to be tested by fire in a conflict that would shape its destiny for centuries to come. The War of 1812 is about to begin. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back in time. If you're fascinated by this pivotal moment in history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Welcome back to our journey through history. In our last chapter, we celebrated America's hard-won independence. But peace, as it often is, was fragile. Today, we delve into Chapter 2, The Roots of Tension, exploring the storm clouds gathering on the horizon that would lead to a second confrontation with Great Britain. The early 19th century was dominated by a colossal struggle across the Atlantic. The Napoleonic Wars. Britain and France were locked in a fight for supremacy, and the young United States found itself caught in the crossfire. Both powers sought to cripple each other's economy, and American trade became a pawn in their global chess match. Britain, with its unrivaled naval might, was particularly aggressive. The Royal Navy began to enforce a series of sweeping naval blockades, essentially drawing a line in the water that American ships were forbidden to cross. Imagine being an American merchant in, say, 1807. Your livelihood, your entire business, depends on selling goods like cotton, tobacco, and timber to markets in Europe. You've invested everything into your ship and its cargo, but as you set sail, you're met not by open ocean, but by the imposing silhouette of a British warship. They board your vessel, inspect your papers, and declare that your destination is off. Your cargo, once a source of potential wealth, is now at risk of being seized. The port you were heading to is under blockade. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a systematic suffocation of American commerce. These weren't just economic frustrations. They struck at the very heart of American sovereignty. The British Orders in Council were decrees that dictated who the United States could and could not trade with. For a nation that had fought a revolution to escape the dictates of a distant king, this felt like a bitter echo of the past. It was as if Britain was treating America not as an equal, but as a subordinate colony once more. The promise of free trade, a cornerstone of the new republic's vision, was being strangled by the very empire it had broken away from. The resentment wasn't just confined to the wharves of Boston or the counting houses of Philadelphia. It rippled across the nation. Newspapers printed fiery editorials decrying British arrogance. In taverns and town squares, conversations buzzed with anger. Had they fought and bled for independence, only to have their right to sail the open seas dictated by London? The spirit of '76 was being rekindled, not by attacks on tea, but by a blockade on trade. American merchants and sailors, the lifeblood of the nation's economy, grew restless. Their patience was wearing thin. The independence they cherished seemed to be under threat yet again, not by soldiers on their soil, but by warships on the high seas. This growing tension was a powder keg, and the fuse was getting shorter by the day. Join us next time as we explore another explosive issue that pushed the two nations closer to the brink. The controversial practice of impressment. It's a story of personal liberty and national honor that you won't want to miss. Thank you for watching. If you're finding this series informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history. We'll see you in the next chapter. Imagine this. You're an American sailor in the early 1800s. The sea is your livelihood. the deck of your ship, your home. You're out on the open ocean, the wind in your sails, trading goods between nations. Suddenly, on the horizon, a ship appears. It's a British warship, a Manoa war, bristling with cannons. It closes in, fires a shot across your bow, and forces your vessel to a halt. British officers board your ship, their faces grim, their authority absolute. They line up your crew, scrutinizing each man. They're not looking for contraband, they're looking for bodies. They point at you, at your friends, at men who have families waiting for them back in Boston, Baltimore, or Charleston. They claim you're a deserter from the Royal Navy, a British subject, regardless of your American citizenship papers, which they often dismiss as worthless scraps of paper. It doesn't matter if you were born in Philadelphia and have never set foot in England. Your protests are ignored. You're dragged off your ship, away from your countrymen, and forced into servitude on a foreign vessel. This wasn't a rare occurrence. This was a terrifying reality for thousands of American sailors. This practice, known as impressment, became one of the most explosive issues of the early 19th century. It was a direct assault on American sovereignty and the liberty of its citizens. The British Royal Navy, locked in a desperate, generation-spanning war with Napoleonic France, was chronically short on manpower. Conditions in the Royal Navy were brutal. Harsh discipline, low pay, and the constant threat of death in battle. Desertion was rampant. So, to fill their ranks, they turned to a centuries-old practice, pressing men into service, and they saw American ships as a prime recruiting ground. They argued that many British sailors had deserted to the better-paying American merchant marine, and were merely reclaiming their own subjects. But in practice, they were indiscriminate. Thousands of native-born Americans were swept up in these naval raids. For the United States, a young nation still trying to establish its place in the world, this was an intolerable humiliation. Each captured sailor was a fresh wound to the national pride. Stories of these kidnappings filled the pages of American newspapers, each one more infuriating than the last. Imagine reading about a young man from your town, seized from a merchant ship just miles from home, now forced to fight and possibly die for the very crown America had fought a revolution to escape. These weren't just news stories. They were personal tragedies that stoked a fire of indignation across the country. The practice of impressment struck at the very heart of what it meant to be an American. The revolution had been fought for liberty, for the right of an individual to be free from the tyranny of a distant king and his military. Now, that same military was snatching American citizens off their own ships on the high seas. It felt like the war for independence had never truly ended. The public outcry was immense. From the taverns on the waterfronts to the halls of Congress, the demand for action grew louder every day. The slogan, "Free Trade and Sailors' Rights," became a rallying cry. It wasn't just about commerce. It was about fundamental human rights and national honor. How could the United States call itself a free and independent nation if it could uneven protect its own citizens from being kidnapped by a foreign power? This sense of outrage wasn't confined to the coast. It spread inland, carried by letters and travelers, becoming a national scandal. Farmers in Ohio and frontiersmen in Kentucky, who might never see the ocean, were just as angered by the injustice. It was an affront to the entire American experiment. The federal government was in a difficult position. Thomas Jefferson and later James Madison tried diplomacy. They protested. They negotiated. They passed embargoes, hoping economic pressure would force Britain to change its policy. But to the British, bogged down in their existential struggle with Napoleon, America's complaints were a secondary concern. Their war effort depended on a powerful navy, and a powerful navy depended on having enough sailors, obtained by any means necessary. The Chesapeake Leopard affair in 1807 brought the crisis to a boiling point. The British warship HMS Leopard fired upon the American frigate USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia, demanding to search for deserters. When the American commander refused, the British opened fire, killing 3 Americans and wounding 18 before boarding and seizing for alleged deserters. The attack on a U.S. naval vessel, an extension of American territory, was an act of war in the eyes of many. The nation was enraged. Cries for war echoed from all corners. While conflict was averted for the moment, the incident left a deep and lasting scar on the American psyche. The issue of impressment demonstrated a fundamental clash of ideologies. For Britain, it was a matter of military necessity in a global war. For America, it was a matter of national sovereignty and individual freedom. The British saw American sailors as potential subjects to be Americans saw them as free citizens being enslaved. This wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a profound moral conflict. The constant seizure of its citizens made America feel powerless and disrespected on the world stage. The promise of liberty, so central to the nation's identity, seemed hollow if it couldn't be guaranteed even a few miles offshore. The anger and frustration simmered, building year after year. Every ship that sailed knew it was a potential target. Every family with a son at sea lived in fear. The United States demanded respect. It demanded that the rights of its sailors be honored and its flag be recognized as the symbol of a truly sovereign nation. As diplomacy failed and the outrages continued, the calls for a more forceful response grew irresistible. The patience of the American people was wearing thin. The nation was being pushed toward a second confrontation with Great Britain, a war to finally secure its independence and command respect on the high seas. The fate of these impressed sailors had become the fate of the nation itself. The year is 1810. America is a young nation, barely 3 decades old, but already brimming with a restless energy. The generation that fought the Revolution, the Founding Fathers, are aging. Their cautious diplomacy, their desire to avoid entanglement in Europe's endless wars, is starting to feel, well, old-fashioned. A new generation is storming the halls of Congress, and they don't share their father's patience. They are young, they are ambitious, and they are angry. They are the war hawks. These aren't your powdered wiggering debate club politicians. These are men forged on the frontier. Men who see the world not in shades of gray, but in black and white. And to them, Great Britain is a bully, a tyrant holding America back. Think of them as the young lions of Congress, pacing, ready to roar. Their leader? A charismatic, silver-tongued Kentuckian named Henry Clay. He's the Speaker of the House, barely in his 30s, but he commands the room with an electrifying presence. He argues that America's honor has been insulted for too long. British impressment of American sailors, their interference with trade. For Clay, these are not just policy disputes. They are personal affronts to the nation's dignity. He thunders from the podium, "Is the time never to arrive when we may manage our own affairs without the fear of insulting His Britannic Majesty?" And he's not alone. By his side stands John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. He's the intellectual powerhouse of the group, a logician with a fiery spirit. Calhoun argues from a different angle, one of national security and economic necessity. He sees Britain's alliances with Native American tribes on the western frontier as a direct threat, a deliberate attempt to box America in and choke its growth. To Calhoun and his allies, the British aren't just a nuisance on the high seas. They are an enemy at the gates, arming indigenous warriors and inciting conflict. The Warhawks believe that negotiations have failed. They've tried embargoes. They've tried diplomacy. Now, they say, it's time for the last resort of injured nations' war. But this isn't just about honor or defense. Oh no. The Warhawks have a much grander vision. They look north, across the Great Lakes, and they see a prize ripe for the picking: Canada. To them, Canada is British North America, a massive, sparsely populated territory that, in their eyes, rightfully belongs in the American sphere. They whisper about manifest destiny long before the term is even coined. The idea is intoxicating. Why stop at the current borders? Why not create a continent-spanning republic free from the influence of any European crown? This dream of conquering Canada becomes a central selling point for the war. Men like Felix Grundy of Tennessee, another prominent warhawk whose family had suffered in frontier conflicts, make it plain. They believe that if they can drive the British out of Canada, they will sever the supply lines to the Native American tribes and secure the entire western frontier for American settlement. It's a 2-for-1 deal. Punish Britain and expand the nation's territory in a single glorious campaign. They paint a picture of an easy victory. The war whoop would be silenced, the scalping knife would be put away, and the fertile lands of Upper Canada would be opened to American farmers. It's a powerful, seductive argument for a country hungry for land and security. The Federalists, the party of the old guard, are horrified. They see the Warhawks as reckless and inexperienced, dragging the country into a conflict it is utterly unprepared to fight. They argue that the army is tiny, the navy is a joke compared to Britain's mighty fleet, and the nation is financially weak. A war with the British Empire, they warn, is national suicide. It's a clash of generations, a battle for the soul of America. Is it the cautious republic envisioned by Washington, or the bold, expansionist empire dreamed of by Clay? But the Warhawks have something the Federalists don't: momentum. Their passionate speeches resonate with a public tired of feeling disrespected on the world stage. They tap into a deep well of anti-British sentiment left over from the Revolution. They are masters of public opinion, portraying anyone who opposes the war as a coward or, even worse, a Tory sympathizer, still loyal to the king. They controlled the key committees in Congress, steering the legislative agenda relentlessly toward a declaration of war. Every British insult, every report of conflict on the frontier is amplified and used as fuel for their cause. President James Madison, a brilliant man but a more reserved leader than his predecessors, finds himself caught in the middle. He's a man of peace, a diplomat at heart. He has tried every conceivable peaceful solution to the crisis with Britain, but the pressure from the Warhawks within his own Democratic Republican Party is becoming immense. They are, in effect, hijacking the party's platform. They surround him. They lobby him. They fill the newspapers with calls to arms. Madison can either lead the charge for war or risk being seen as a weak, ineffective leader, swept aside by the tides of history. The Warhawks' message is simple and powerful. A second war of independence is needed. The first war won America its political freedom, but this second war would win its economic and psychological freedom. It would prove, once and for all, that the United States was not a collection of former colonies, but a true and equal power on the world stage, capable of defending its rights and shaping its own destiny. This wasn't just about trade routes or sailors. It was about the very character of the nation. Would America be a country that backed down, or one that stood up for itself? By the spring of 1812, the momentum is unstoppable. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and their band of young, fiery patriots have successfully shifted the national conversation. The debate is no longer if America should go to war, but when the old guard has been outmaneuvered. The dream of a vast American continent, the anger over national humiliation, and the relentless political maneuvering of the war hawks have all converged. The stage is set, the fuse is lit. The young republic, guided by its ambitious new leaders, is about to march willingly into the fires of war with the most powerful empire on earth. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of our series. If you're enjoying this deep dive into American history, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We'll see you in the next video. Soft, thoughtful music begins. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a pivotal moment, a turning point that would define a young nation. We enter the world of James Madison, the fourth President of the United States. This is Chapter 5, President Madison's Dilemma. Imagine the weight on his shoulders. James Madison wasn't a fiery, impulsive leader. He was a scholar, a man of reason, known for his calm and cautious demeanor. He was one of the primary architects of the Constitution, a man who believed deeply in the power of law and diplomacy. The last thing he wanted was to plunge his fledgling country into another war with the world's greatest superpower, Great Britain. Yet, the storm clouds were gathering, and the pressure was immense. For years, Madison had tried to navigate a treacherous path. Britain, locked in a desperate struggle with Napoleon's France, had adopted policies that were crippling American trade. The most egregious of these was the practice of impressment. British warships would stop American vessels on the high seas, boarding them and kidnapping sailors they claimed were British deserters. Thousands of American citizens were forced into service in the Royal Navy, a profound insult to American sovereignty and a violation of basic human rights. Madison, ever the diplomat, exhausted every peaceful option. He sent envoys, wrote letters, and implemented economic sanctions like the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. The idea was to use economic pressure to force Britain and France to respect American neutrality. But these measures backfired. They devastated the American economy, particularly in New England, where merchants and sailors saw their livelihoods vanish overnight. Instead of compelling respect from Europe, the sanctions created widespread discontent and political division at home. The Federalists in the North openly criticized Madison, some even hinting at secession. Meanwhile, a new, younger generation was rising in Congress. These were the Warhawks, men like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. They were born after the Revolution. They hadn't experienced its horrors firsthand. They were filled with a fiery nationalism and a deep-seated resentment of British arrogance. They saw Britain's actions not just as economic inconveniences, but as a direct assault on America's honor. They argued that diplomacy had failed and that the only way to defend American rights and prove its legitimacy as a nation was through force of arms. Their passionate speeches echoed through the halls of Congress, stirring up a potent mix of patriotism and indignation. The Warhawks also had their eyes on westward expansion. They accused the British of inciting Native American tribes on the frontier, supplying them with weapons and encouraging them to resist American settlement. The conflict with tribes, led by figures like the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh, was seen as a proxy war, fueled and supported by British agents in Canada. For the Warhawks, war with Britain offered a golden opportunity, not only to end the menace of impressment, but also to seize Canada and remove the British threat from the continent once and for all. Madison found himself caught in a vice. On one side, he had the relentless pressure from the Warhawks, who commanded a growing majority in Congress, and accused him of weakness. On the other, he faced the stubborn intransigence of the British government, which, consumed with its war against Napoleon, paid little heed to American protests. The diplomatic channels were exhausted. Every letter, every negotiation, every economic gambit had led to a dead end. The nation's pride was wounded, and the fundamental principle of sovereignty was at stake. Could the United States truly call itself an independent nation if it could not protect its own ships and its own citizens on the open ocean? The pressure became unbearable. The clamor for war grew louder each day. Madison, the man of peace and reason, had to confront a stark reality. His preferred methods had failed. To continue on the same path would be seen as cowardice, potentially fracturing the fragile union he had worked so hard to build. The nation's honor was on the line. The very experiment of American democracy seemed to hang in the balance. Was it strong enough to defend itself? And so, with a heavy heart, James Madison made his choice. He had weighed the risks, the potential for disaster, the deep divisions within his own country. He knew the United States was woefully unprepared for war. The army was small, the navy consisted of just a handful of ships, and the country was financially strained. Yet, the alternative, submission to British dictates, was unthinkable. Pride and principle had overtaken caution. In a message to Congress on June 1st, 1812, Madison laid out the long list of grievances against Great Britain. The impressment of sailors, the constant harassment of American trade, and the incitement of Native American hostilities. He asked Congress to consider the question, but his message was a clear, if reluctant, call to arms. After weeks of heated debate, Congress voted largely along party and sectional lines to declare war. On June 18, 1812, President James Madison signed the declaration. The United States of America was officially at war with Great Britain for the second time in less than 40 years. It was a bold, uncertain, and incredibly risky move. The father of the Constitution had just become a wartime president, leading a divided and unprepared nation into a conflict against the most formidable military power on earth. No one knew how it would end. Would this be the war that finally secured America's place in the world? Or would it be the disastrous gamble that tore the young republic apart? The die was cast, and the nation stepped into the unknown. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story of the War of 1812 is filled with incredible drama, surprising victories, and devastating setbacks. And we'll dive right into the opening shots in our next episode. If you're finding this series valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It really helps us continue to create this content for you. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the War of 1812. Last time, we explored the spark that ignited the conflict. Now, in Chapter 6, we delve into the fire itself. Specifically, the opening moves of the war and what can only be described as a series of early, staggering blunders by the American forces. The year is 1812, and the United States, brimming with a mix of optimism and overconfidence, sets its sights on what it believes will be a simple prize: Canada. The prevailing thought in Washington was that conquering British North America would be, as Thomas Jefferson famously put it, a mere matter of marching. This assumption would prove to be disastrously, almost comically, wrong. The grand American strategy was a three-pronged invasion aimed at capturing key Canadian territories. The plan looked ambitious on paper, but the reality on the ground was a mess from the very beginning. The first prong, led by General William Hull, was to advance from Detroit into Upper Canada. The second, under General Stephen Van Rensselaer, would cross the Niagara River, and the third, commanded by General Henry Dearborn, was supposed to march north from Lake Champlain to take Montreal. It was a strategy that required coordination, discipline, and a well-supplied army. Unfortunately for the Americans, they had none of these. Let's start with General Hull's expedition. Hull was an aging veteran of the Revolutionary War, and his leadership was hesitant at best. He crossed the Detroit River into Canada in July 1812 and issued a proclamation to the inhabitants, promising them liberation from British tyranny. He expected Canadians to flock to his banner. Instead, he was met with suspicion and resistance. While he dithered, unsure of his next move, his supply lines were cut by British forces and their formidable native allies, led by the brilliant Shawnee chief, Tecumseh. This is where the poor planning really began to bite. The American army was a shadow of its Revolutionary era self. It was small, poorly trained, and woefully equipped. Many of the soldiers were militia members who were reluctant to fight outside of their home states, let alone invade another country. Their officers were often political appointees with little to no military experience. The command structure was a tangled web of rivalries and indecision. General Hull, for instance, was terrified of the native warriors allied with the British. The psychological impact of their presence cannot be overstated. Faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation, Hull's confidence completely evaporated. The British commander, General Isaac Brock, was the polar opposite of Hull. He was decisive, bold, and had a keen understanding of military strategy. He saw Hull's hesitation and decided to press his advantage. In a masterful bluff, Brock and Tecumseh orchestrated a series of maneuvers that made their combined force of British regulars, Canadian militia, and native warriors appear much larger than it actually was. They paraded their troops in view of the American fort at Detroit multiple times to inflate their numbers. Tecumseh marched his warriors through a clearing, circled around unseen, and marched through again, creating the illusion of an endless stream of fighters. The psychological warfare worked perfectly. Terrified by the prospect of a massacre at the hands of Tecumseh-esque warriors, and convinced he was hopelessly outnumbered, General Hull surrendered Fort Detroit in August 1812 without firing a single shot. It was a humiliating and catastrophic defeat for the United States. An entire American army, along with the strategically vital fort, was lost. Hull's mere matter of marching had turned into a full-scale retreat and surrender, sending shockwaves of disbelief and anger throughout the country. Now, let's turn our attention to the second prong of the invasion, the Niagara Front. Here, the situation was just as chaotic. The American forces were commanded by General Stephen Van Rensselaer, a wealthy politician with zero combat experience. He commanded a force of New York militia who were camped on the American side of the Niagara River, looking across at the British-held Queenston Heights. The pressure to act was immense, especially after the debacle at Detroit. In October 1812, Van Rensselaer finally ordered an attack across the river. The initial assault was actually successful. A small contingent of American regulars managed to cross under heavy fire and scale the steep cliffs of Queenston Heights, capturing a key British artillery position. It looked like a potential victory was in their grasp. But then, everything fell apart. The British commander, the same energetic General Brock who had taken Detroit, rushed to the scene to lead a in the fierce fighting that followed. Brock was tragically killed by an American sniper, a huge loss for the British cause. You might think Brock's death would have demoralized the British and solidified the American victory, but you'd be wrong. Instead, it galvanized them. Meanwhile, on the American side of the river, disaster was unfolding. the bulk of Van Rensselaer's militia. Upon seeing the wounded being ferried back and hearing the sounds of battle, flat out refused to cross into Canada. Citing their constitutional right not to fight on foreign soil, they simply stood and watched as their comrades on the other side were overwhelmed. The American regulars who had fought so bravely were left isolated and unsupported. Eventually, surrounded by enraged British and Mohawk warriors, they were forced to surrender. The Battle of Queenston Heights became another crushing American defeat, born from a fatal combination of inexperienced leadership and a deeply divided, undisciplined army. Two prongs of the invasion had now failed spectacularly. What about the third? The main thrust towards Montreal, led by the senior commander of the U.S. Army, General Henry Dearborn. Surely, this would be the one to succeed. Dearborn, another aging Revolutionary War veteran, assembled a large force near Lake Champlain. His objective was the most important of all: Montreal. Taking it would sever the supply lines for all British forces in Upper Canada and likely end the war. But Dearborn was slow, cautious, and plagued by the same issues as his fellow generals. His army was a mix of regulars and militia from various states, and coordination was a nightmare. After weeks of delays, Dearborn finally began his advance in late November. He marched his army a short distance into Canada. Almost immediately, things went wrong. A small skirmish in the dark led to American units firing on each other in a panic. The militia, once again, proved unreliable. Echoing the events at Queenston Heights, many refused to go any further, arguing their service did not require them to leave the United States. Faced with a near mutiny, and unwilling to risk a major engagement with an army he couldn't control, Dearborn simply gave up. He turned his army around and marched back to American territory. The grand invasion of Montreal, the most critical part of the entire strategy, ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. So, by the end of 1812, the great American invasion of Canada was an unmitigated disaster. 3 armies had been sent forth, and all 3 had failed. Detroit was lost, the Niagara campaign was a bloody failure, and the march on Montreal was abandoned before it even began. These early blunders were a brutal wake-up call for the United States. They exposed the nation's military weakness, the folly of relying on poorly trained militia, and the incompetence of its senior leadership. The dream of a quick and easy conquest was shattered. Instead, the Americans now found themselves on the defensive, facing a determined enemy invigorated by their own success. The British and their native allies had not only repelled the invasion, but were now striking back fiercely, raiding American settlements along the frontier. The war was far from over, but its opening chapter was a story of American hubris and humiliating defeat. Thank you so much for joining us for this look at the early disasters of the War of 1812. It's a stark reminder that in war, plans on paper mean little without competence on the battlefield. What happens next? How does the United States recover from this disastrous start? We'll explore that and more in our next chapter. If you're finding this series informative, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next installment. We'll see you then. As the War of 1812 raged between the United States and Great Britain, another, much older conflict was reaching its boiling point. This wasn't just a war between two nations born from the same motherland. It was a multi-front struggle for the very soul of the North American continent. And at the heart of this struggle were the original inhabitants of the land, the native nations who saw this war not as a distant affair of empires, but as their last desperate chance to preserve their way of life, their lands, and their very existence. This is the story of their crucial role a chapter often overshadowed but absolutely central to understanding the true scope of the War of 1812. At the center of this indigenous resistance was a name that would echo through history. Tecumseh. He was more than a warrior. He was a visionary, a diplomat, and a prophet of unity. Born into the Shawnee Nation in the Ohio Valley, Tecumseh witnessed firsthand the relentless tide of American expansion. He saw treaties signed and broken, ancestral lands seized, and his people pushed further and further west. He realized that individual tribes, no matter how fiercely they fought, would be picked off one by one. The only hope for survival, he believed, was for all tribes to cast aside their old rivalries and unite as one people. A great confederacy, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Tecumseh's vision was powerful and persuasive. Alongside his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, he traveled tirelessly, delivering a message of spiritual renewal and political unity. He argued that the land was a common inheritance, a gift from the Great Spirit that no single tribe had the right to sell. He urged a return to traditional ways and a complete rejection of American culture. From the alcohol that devastated their communities, to the concept of private land ownership that fractured their world. His eloquence and conviction were magnetic. Warriors from the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Ottawa, and many other nations flocked to his banner, drawn by the promise of a future where they, not the encroaching settlers, would determine their own destiny. They gathered at a settlement called Prophetstown, which became the vibrant capital of this emerging Pan-Indian alliance. The American government, led by figures like William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, saw Tecumseh's Confederacy as a direct and existential threat. Harrison's policy was one of aggressive land acquisition, using a mix of dubious treaties, pressure, and intimidation to dispossess the tribes. He saw Tecumseh not as a statesman, but as an obstacle to be removed. The tension was a powder keg waiting for a spark. While Tecumseh was away on a recruiting mission to the southern tribes, Harrison saw his chance. In 1811, he marched his army on Prophetstown. The resulting Battle of Tippecanoe was a brutal and chaotic clash. While technically a narrow American victory, its true significance was political. Harrison's forces burned Prophetstown to the ground, shattering the physical heart of the Confederacy. This act of aggression did not break the spirit of the resistance. Instead, it clarified the stakes and hardened resolves. For Tecumseh, the attack was the final, undeniable proof that peaceful coexistence with the Americans was impossible. They would never stop. They would never honor a treaty. They would never respect the rights of his people. With his dream of a purely indigenous alliance dealt a severe blow. Tecumseh saw only one viable path forward: an alliance with the other major power in North America. The British, the enemy of his enemy, had to become his friend. When war officially broke out between the United States and Great Britain in 1812, Tecumseh and his Confederacy were ready. They formally allied with the British, transforming the conflict in the Northwest. This wasn't just a sideshow, it was a crucial front. Tecumseh's warriors were not mere auxiliaries. They were skilled, motivated, and knowledgeable fighters who provided the British with something they desperately needed: a formidable force on the ground that knew the terrain intimately. Tecumseh's leadership was instrumental in several key early victories for the British. His tactical genius and the psychological impact of his warriors played a decisive role in the stunning capture of Fort Detroit, a humiliating defeat for the Americans. General Isaac Brock, the British commander, held Tecumseh in the highest regard, recognizing him as a true co-commander and a brilliant strategist. Together, they formed a powerful partnership that terrified the American frontier. This alliance added a dangerous and unpredictable new dimension to the war. For the United States, it meant they weren't just fighting the redcoats of the British Army. They were fighting a multi-front war against a coordinated force of British regulars, Canadian militia, and thousands of determined native warriors, led by one of the most charismatic and capable military leaders of his generation. The fighting in the Old Northwest, what we now call the Midwest, was brutal and personal. It was a war of raids and ambushes, of forts besieged and settlements burned. For the American settlers on the frontier, the fear was palpable. Every shadow in the forest could hide a warrior fighting not for a king across the ocean, but for the very land beneath their feet. The struggle became more than a clash of nations. It was a collision of peoples, each fighting for their own vision of survival and their own definition of home. For the Americans, it was about securing their new nation and fulfilling what they saw as their manifest destiny to expand across the continent. For the British, it was about defending their Canadian colonies and containing American power. But for Tecumseh and the members of his confederacy, the stakes were the highest of all. They weren't fighting for territory or for geopolitical advantage. They were fighting for their existence. They were fighting to preserve their cultures, their sovereignty, and their ancestral connection to a land that had sustained them for millennia. Every battle was a desperate gamble to turn back the clock, to halt the relentless advance of the Long Knives, and to carve out a future where their children could live as they had lived. The War of 1812, for them, was the final, great war for the heart of the continent. But as the war dragged on, the tide began to turn. The crucial partnership between Tecumseh and General Brock was shattered when Brock was killed in battle. His replacements lacked his vision and his respect for their native allies. Then, in 1813, a decisive American naval victory on Lake Erie cut off British and native forces from their supply lines. The British commander, Henry Proctor, decided to retreat, abandoning the positions they had fought so hard to win. Tecumseh was disgusted and enraged. He accused Proctor of cowardice, famously saying, "You have the arms and ammunition which our great father sent for his red children. If you have an idea of going away, give them to us and you may go and welcome. Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is His will, we wish to leave our bones upon them." His passionate plea shamed Proctor into making a stand. Near the Thames River in Ontario, the combined British and native forces met the pursuing American army, led once again by their old nemesis, William Henry Harrison. The Battle of the Thames was a disaster for the British-Native alliance. The British lines quickly collapsed, and Proctor himself fled the field. But Tecumseh and his warriors stood their ground and fought with incredible ferocity. In the chaos of that battle, Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader, the visionary unifier, was killed. With his death, the heart of the indigenous resistance was ripped out. The Confederacy he had so painstakingly built dissolved almost overnight. No other leader possessed his unique combination of military skill, diplomatic acumen, and spiritual authority. The dream of a united, independent native nation in the heartland of America died with him on the battlefield. When the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814, ending the war, the British abandoned their former allies. The treaty restored the pre-war borders, but made no provisions for the native nations, leaving them to face the new unfettered expansion of the United States alone. The war that had been their last, best hope had ended in their ultimate defeat. The struggle for the continent was over. The path was now clear for American expansion to the Pacific, a tragic and profound consequence of the native nation's courageous but doomed fight for survival. Thank you so much for joining us for this crucial chapter of the War of 1812. it as a story of incredible courage and tragic loss that deserves to be remembered. If you found this perspective valuable, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you net miss the next part of our series. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the War of 1812. Today, we're diving into Chapter 8, Battles on the Great Lakes. Now, you might be thinking, naval battles in the middle of the continent, and you'd be right to be curious. But during this conflict, the Great Lakes weren't just bodies of water. They were liquid highways, strategic super corridors that could make or break a campaign. Whoever controlled the lakes controlled the flow of troops, supplies, and information into the contested territories of the Old Northwest and Upper Canada. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In the early stages of the war, the British Royal Navy had a distinct advantage on the lakes. They had more ships, more experienced sailors, and a well-established presence. The Americans, playing catch-up, had to build a fleet from scratch. Imagine the scene. Deep in the forests of Pennsylvania and Ohio, shipbuilders were felling trees, sawing timber, and forging iron, racing against time to construct a navy on the shores of Lake Erie. It was an incredible feat of frontier industry and determination. They weren't just building boats, they were building a chance to turn the tide of the war. Leading this ambitious and seemingly impossible project was a young, dynamic naval officer named Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry. Perry was only 27 years old, but he possessed a fiery resolve and a brilliant strategic mind. He arrived at Presque Isle, which is modern-day Erie, Pennsylvania, in early 1813 to find a chaotic scene. There were half-finished ships, a shortage of skilled workers, and the constant threat of a British attack. Yet, Perry's energy was infectious. He oversaw every detail, from procuring cannons to recruiting sailors, sometimes even from the ranks of local Pennsylvania militia and frontiersmen who had never set foot on a ship before. The challenge wasn't just building the ships, it was getting them onto the lake. The British fleet, under the command of the cautious but capable Commander Robert Barclay, blockaded the harbor at Presque Isle. Perry's newly built brigs, the USS Lawrence and the USS Niagara, were too large to cross the shallow sandbar at the harbor's entrance with their full armament. Perry had to make a daring move. He waited for a moment when Barclay's fleet briefly withdrew, then ordered his men to work around the clock. They unloaded the cannons, used large barges called camels to lift the ships over the sandbar, and then hastily rearmed them on the open water. It was a nerve-wracking gamble that paid off, and by August 80th, the American squadron was finally afloat on Lake Erie, ready to challenge British supremacy. The stage was set for one of the most decisive naval engagements of the war. On the morning of September 10, 1813, the lookouts on Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, spotted the British fleet. The two squadrons were remarkably balanced. Both had a similar number of vessels, though the American ships possessed an advantage in short-range firepower with their heavy carronades, while the British had more long-range guns. The wind was light and fickle, which would play a crucial role in the battle to come. Perry knew that he needed to close the distance quickly to bring his powerful carronades to bear. He hoisted a large blue battle flag, emblazoned with the dying words of his friend Captain James Lawrence. "Do you give up the ship?" It was a message of defiance and a promise of a fight to the finish. As the battle began, disaster struck the American line. The wind died down, leaving Perry's second-in-command, Jesse Elliott, on the USS Niagara, too far back to effectively join the fight. For over 2 hours, Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, bore the brunt of the entire British fleet's firepower. The deck became a scene of absolute carnage. Masts splintered, cannons were dismounted, and the ship was shot to pieces. A staggering 80% of the crew on the Lawrence were killed or wounded. Yet, through the smoke and chaos, Perry remained resolute. The Lawrence was a floating wreck, its guns silenced, but its flag that, "Don't give up" the ship banner still flew. With his flagship destroyed and the battle hanging by a thread, Oliver Hazard Perry made a decision that would become the stuff of legend. He refused to surrender. Leaving the battered Lawrence in the command of a junior officer, he took down his personal pennant and the iconic battle flag, climbed into a small rowboat with a handful of uninjured men, and began a perilous journey through a storm of British cannon and musket fire toward the undamaged USS Niagara. It was an act of incredible audacity. For 15 minutes, he was a clear target for the enemy, but miraculously, he reached the Niagara unscathed. Climbing aboard the deck of the Niagara, Perry immediately took command from a hesitant Captain Elliott. He wasn't just saving himself. He was saving the entire battle. He ordered the fresh Niagara to sail directly into the heart of the British line, splitting their formation. The maneuver was perfectly timed. The British ships, already damaged from their long fight with the Lawrence, were entangled and unable to maneuver effectively. The Niagara, followed by the smaller American gunboats that had finally caught up, unleashed devastating broadsides at close range. The effect was catastrophic for the British. Within minutes, the flagship HMS Detroit and other major vessels were disabled. One by one, the British flags came down. Commander Berkeley himself, severely wounded, had no choice but to surrender his entire fleet. For the first time in history, an entire British naval squadron had been captured. After the smoke cleared, Perry sat down and, using the back of an old envelope, penned one of the most famous dispatches in American military history to General William Henry Harrison. It was brief, humble, and powerful. "Dear General, we have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours, with great respect and esteem, O.H. Perry." The victory at the Battle of Lake Erie was a monumental turning point. It severed British supply lines, forced them to abandon Detroit, and opened the door for General Harrison's army to retake lost territory and win the decisive Battle of the Thames just a few weeks later. Perry's victory transformed him into a national hero, a symbol of American courage and ingenuity against the odds. His famous words, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," became a rallying cry that echoed across the young nation. The battle proved that on the frontier, with logs turned into warships and farmers turned into sailors, America could stand and fight and win. Thanks so much for joining us for this chapter. The story of the War of 1812 is full of these incredible moments of bravery and strategy. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the War of 1812. Today, we arrive at a pivotal moment, Chapter 9. Turning tides in the north. After a series of setbacks and stalemates, the momentum on the northern front is about to shift dramatically. The stage is set for a confrontation that will not only alter the course of the war in this region, but also seal the fate of a powerful Native American confederacy. The year is 1813, and the Americans have just won a crucial naval victory on Lake Erie. This triumph, under the command of Oliver Hazard Perry, severed British supply lines and forced their army, under General Henry Proctor, into a hasty retreat from Detroit and Malden. But Proctor wasn't just abandoning territory. He was abandoning his crucial allies, a formidable Native American confederacy, led by the visionary Shawnee chief, Tecumseh. Tecumseh was furious. He saw Proctor's retreat for what it was, a betrayal that left his people's lands vulnerable. In a fiery speech, he accused Proctor of cowardice, comparing him to a fat dog that drops its tail and runs. Despite his deep misgivings, Tecumseh and his warriors had little choice but to accompany the retreating British, hoping to make a stand further east. The American force, led by General William Henry Harrison, name you'll remember from the Battle of Tippecanoe, was in hot pursuit. Harrison, buoyed by his naval support and a large contingent of Kentucky riflemen eager for a fight, was determined to crush the British and native forces once and for all. The chase was on. The British retreat was disorganized and demoralizing. Proctor seemed unable to pick a defensible position, constantly moving eastward, much to the frustration of Tecumseh. Finally, on October 5, 1813, near Moraviantown, on the banks of the Thames River in present-day Ontario, Tecumseh convinced Proctor that they could retreat no further. Here, they would make their stand. The ground was not ideal. Proctor positioned his British regulars in a line with their flank exposed to the river. Tecumseh and his warriors took up a more strategic position in a dense swamp to the right of the British line, a terrain that favored their style of fighting. The American forces arrived, and Harrison, a savvy commander, quickly assessed the situation. He noticed that the British regulars were deployed in an open order, a tactic meant to counter traditional line infantry. But Harrison had a different idea. Instead of a conventional infantry assault, he decided to do something audacious, a direct cavalry charge. He ordered Colonel Richard Minter Johnson and his Kentucky mounted riflemen to charge straight into the British lines. It was a brilliant and unorthodox move. The bugles sounded, and the Kentuckians thundered forward. The British regulars, caught completely by surprise, fired a single, ineffective volley before the horsemen crashed into their ranks. The shock was overwhelming. Within minutes, the British line disintegrated. Men threw down their muskets and surrendered en masse. General Proctor himself, witnessing the collapse, abandoned his men and fled the battlefield in his carriage. A final act of the entire British left flank had crumbled in less than 10 minutes. But the battle was far from over. While the British regulars had folded, Tecumseh and his warriors in the swamp fought with ferocious determination. The first American charge into the swamp was repulsed by withering fire. Colonel Johnson himself was wounded multiple times as he led the assault. The fighting here was brutal, close quarters combat amidst the thick trees and marshy ground. The warriors of the Confederacy were fighting not just for an ally, but for their homes, their families, and their very way of life. And at the heart of this desperate struggle was Tecumseh. He moved among his warriors, his powerful voice urging them on, a charismatic and fearless leader to the very end. The Americans, dismounted, pressed their attack. The fighting raged, and casualties mounted on both sides. Then, amidst the chaos of the swamp, the unthinkable happened. Tecumseh was struck down. The exact circumstances of his death are shrouded in the fog of war, with several American soldiers later claiming the distinction of having killed the great chief. But the effect of his fall was immediate and devastating. With their leader gone, the heart of the native resistance was broken. The warriors, who had fought so bravely, began to melt away into the wilderness. The organized opposition that had defined the northern frontier ceased to exist. The Battle of the Thames was over, and it was a resounding American victory. The consequences of this single battle were immense. First, the American victory secured the entire northwest frontier. Never again would the British or their native allies seriously threaten Ohio, Indiana, or Michigan. The region was firmly in American hands for the remainder of the war. Second, It was a massive blow to British prestige and a corresponding surge for American morale. After a long and often frustrating campaign in the North, the decisive victory at the Thames provided a much-needed shot in the arm for the American war effort. William Henry Harrison became a national hero, a reputation that would eventually propel him to the presidency. But the most significant and tragic outcome was the death of Tecumseh and the subsequent collapse of his Confederacy. For years, Tecumseh had worked to unite the tribes of the region into a powerful bloc capable of resisting American expansion. He was a brilliant strategist, a skilled diplomat, and a visionary leader. With his death, the dream of a unified, independent Native American nation east of the Mississippi effectively died with him. The Battle of the Thames wasn't just a military victory for the United States. It was the final, tragic chapter in the struggle for native sovereignty in the Old Northwest. The Northern Front, which had been a source of constant anxiety and frequent defeat for the Americans, was now stabilized. The threat was neutralized. This allowed the United States to refocus its resources and attention on other fronts, particularly the ongoing war on the Niagara frontier and the looming threat of a British invasion along the Atlantic coast. The tide in the north had truly turned thanks to a decisive cavalry charge and the tragic end of a great leader on the banks of the Thames River. The war was far from over, but the strategic landscape had been permanently altered. Thank you so much for joining us for this crucial chapter in the War of 1812. It is a story of strategy, desperation, and lasting consequences. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll explore the continuing conflict on other fronts. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the War of 1812. So far, we've seen the United States stumble on land, facing a series of frustrating defeats and setbacks against the seasoned British Army. It seemed like the young republic had bitten off more than it could chew. But while the army was struggling, a different story was unfolding on the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the story of how a fledgling navy, dismissed and underestimated, sailed into legend. It's the story of iron men and wooden ships, and how, for the first time, the American flag earned the world's respect on the high seas. Let's set the stage. In 1812, the British Royal Navy was the undisputed master of the waves. They had over 600 warships, a global network of naval bases, and generations of experience honed in the Napoleonic Wars. They were the titans of the sea. In stark contrast, the United States Navy was a minnow. It possessed fewer than 20 warships, many of them small gunboats designed for coastal defense. On paper, it was no contest. The British confidently declared they would sweep the Americans from the ocean. Many Americans, including some in Congress, feared they were right. Why even risk sending our precious few ships out to be captured or sunk by the British Leviathan? But President James Madison and his naval commanders, men like Stephen Decatur and Isaac Hull, believed otherwise. They knew they couldn't win a fleet-and-fleet battle. That would be suicide. But they could do something else. They could engage in single-ship duels. They could use their secret weapon a new class of heavy frigates that were bigger, faster, and packed a heavier punch than their British counterparts. These weren't just ships. They were a statement. And the most famous of them all was a vessel that would soon earn a legendary nickname, the USS Constitution. Launched in 1797, the Constitution was one of the original 6 frigates of the U.S. Navy. She was a marvel of naval engineering. Her hull was constructed from incredibly dense southern live oak, making it exceptionally resistant to cannon fire. She was rated as a 44-gun frigate, but she often carried over 50 cannons, giving her a devastating broadside. She was designed to be powerful enough to defeat any frigate and fast enough to escape from a ship of the line, the battleships of the era. On August 19, 1812, just 2 months into the war, the Constitution, under the command of Captain Isaac Hull, would get her chance to prove her worth. Off the coast of Nova Scotia, lookouts aboard the Constitution spotted a lone sail. It was the British frigate HMS Guerrière. The Guerrière's captain, James Dacres, was supremely confident. He had famously issued a challenge to any American frigate to come out and fight. Now, his wish was granted. As the two ships closed, the British, following their standard tactic, began firing from a distance. But Captain Hull held his nerve. He ordered his crew to hold their fire, closing the distance until the ships were practically side by side, a mere 25 yards apart. The tension on deck must have been unbearable. Then Hull gave the order. "Now, boys, pour it into them." The Constitution erupted in a massive, coordinated broadside. The effect was immediate and catastrophic, for the cannonballs smashed through her hull, and her mizzenmast, rearmost mast cracked and crashed into the sea, crippling her ability to maneuver. The American gunnery was faster and far more accurate. During the exchange, a British sailor reportedly saw a cannonball bounce off the Constitution's thick oak hull and exclaimed, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron." The legend of Old Ironsides was born right there, in the heat of battle. The fight lasted less than 30 minutes. The Guerrière was left a dismasted, helpless wreck, so shattered that the Americans couldn't even tow her to port. Captain Dacres was forced to surrender his ship and his sword to Captain Hull. When news of this stunning victory reached the United States, the nation exploded with joy and relief. After so much bad news from the land campaigns, here was a clear, undeniable triumph. Bells rang in cities, celebratory parades were held, and Captain Hull and his crew were hailed as national heroes. It was more than just a naval victory. It was a massive boost to American morale. It proved that the mighty Royal Navy was not invincible. An American ship, with an American crew, had met a British frigate in single combat and had utterly defeated it. And it wasn't a fluke. The victories kept coming. In October 1812, the frigate USS United States, commanded by the dashing Stephen Decatur, captured the British frigate HMS Macedonian in an incredible feat of seamanship. Decatur managed to bring the captured Macedonian all the way back to a U.S. port, where she was repaired and actually incorporated into the U.S. Navy. Imagine the sight. A captured British warship, sailing under the stars and stripes, arriving in an American harbor. It was the ultimate trophy, a tangible symbol of American naval prowess. Then, in December, it was Old Ironsides' turn again. Now, under the command of Commodore William Bain, the Constitution encountered the British frigate HMS Java off the coast of Brazil. This was a longer, more brutal fight. Both ships took a beating, and Bainbridge himself was wounded twice. But once again, the superior design, heavy firepower, and skilled gunnery of the American frigate proved decisive. After a 2-hour battle, the Java was a burning, dismasted hulk, forced to surrender. The Constitution had done it again, solidifying her reputation as the nation's champion. These frigate duels electrified the nation. They were the talk of every town and tavern. Newspapers printed dramatic accounts of the battles, and songs and poems were written to celebrate the heroes. For the first time, Americans felt a deep, collective pride in their navy. This wasn't just about winning battles. It was about earning respect on the world stage. For decades, American sailors had been harassed, and their ships had been stopped and searched with impunity by the Royal Navy. Now, the American flag on the mast of a warship was a symbol of defiance and strength. It meant something. Of course, these individual victories, glorious as they were, couldn't change the overall strategic reality. The Royal Navy's blockade of the American coast eventually tightened, bottling up most of the American frigates in port for the latter half of the war. But the damage to British pride had been done. They were forced to issue new orders. Their frigates were no longer to engage American heavy frigates. They had to hunt in pairs. This, in itself, was a massive concession and a testament to the fear and respect the American ships had inspired. The war at sea showed that even though the United States was a young and developing nation, it could innovate and compete with the world's greatest power. The legacy of Old Ironsides and her sister ships sailed far beyond the War of 1812, shaping the identity and the future of the United States Navy for generations to come. Thank you so much for watching. The story of the war is far from over. So if you enjoyed this look at the battles on the high seas, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you then.
Across the Atlantic, a seismic shift was underway. The year is 1814. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had held Europe in his iron grip for over a decade, was finally defeated. Exiled. For Great Britain, this wasn't just the end of a long and brutal war. It was an opportunity to settle a score across the ocean. For 2 years, while locked in a death struggle with France, they had been fighting a frustrating and distracting war with the upstart United States. Now, with their primary enemy vanquished, the full, undivided might of the British Empire could be turned westward. The war in America was about to change drastically. What had been a sideshow was about to become the main event. The British war machine, hardened by years of fighting the world's greatest army, was now free. Thousands of veteran troops, the best of the best, boarded ships, their destination, the shores of the United States. This was no longer a war of naval skirmishes and frontier raids. This was the real invasion. The war was coming home to America in a way they had never imagined. The British weren't just looking to teach the Americans a lesson anymore. They were looking to deliver a knockout blow. The target for this overwhelming force was the very heart of the young republic. The Chesapeake Bay became the gateway for the British Armada. Seasoned generals, men who had faced down Napoleon's marshals, now planned their American campaign. Their strategy was bold and audacious. Strike at the political and symbolic center of the United States. Cities up and down the East Coast braced for impact, but one city in particular was marked for retribution. A city named for the nation's founding father, Washington D.C. The fledgling capital, with its half-finished buildings and grand, aspirational avenues, was about to feel the full fury of an empire striking back. The British were coming, and they intended to burn the capital of the United States to the ground.
Welcome back to our series on the War of 1812. We've now reached one of the most dramatic and frankly humiliating moments in American history. The burning of Washington. This is Chapter 12. The year is 1814. For 2 years, the United States and Great Britain have been locked in a bitter conflict. The war has seen battles rage from the Canadian border to the high seas. But now, The British are planning a move that will strike at the very heart of the young American Republic. By August, the war in Europe against Napoleon had ended, freeing up thousands of veteran British troops. Their new destination, the United States. A formidable force under the command of Major General Robert Ross landed in Maryland, just a stone's throw from the American capital. Their objective was clear: to inflict a blow so devastating it would cripple American morale and force a surrender. The American defense was, to put it mildly, a mess. General William Winder, tasked with protecting the capital, commanded a force of mostly inexperienced militia. They were ill-equipped, poorly trained, and lacked a coherent strategy. The stage was set for a disaster. On August 24, 1814, the two forces met at Bladensburg, Maryland. The battle that followed was so one-sided, it became known as the Bladensburg Races, not because it was a competition, but because of how quickly the American militia fled the field. The professional British soldiers, battle-hardened from years of fighting in Europe, simply overwhelmed them. The road to Washington was now wide open. Panic gripped the capital. Government officials, clerks, and citizens scrambled to evacuate, grabbing whatever documents and personal belongings they could carry. Among them was President James Madison. He had been near the battlefield, and upon seeing the American lines collapse, he was forced to flee, becoming the only sitting president to face enemy fire in battle. He and his government were now fugitives. While the president was in retreat, First Lady Dolly Madison became the hero of the hour. At the president's house, now known as the White House, she refused to leave until she had secured vital state papers and, most famously, the magnificent full-length portrait of George Washington. She understood its symbolic importance. She wrote to her sister, "I am determined not to go myself until I see Mr. Madison safe. Our kind friend, Mr. Carroll, has come to hasten my departure, and is in a very bad humor with me, because I insist on waiting until the large picture of General Washington is secured." With minutes to spare, the canvas was cut from its frame and carried away to safety. Just as British soldiers were entering the city that evening, on August 24th, the British troops marched into a nearly deserted Washington, D.C. General Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn, who was known for his particular animosity towards Americans, rode to the Capitol building. They held a mock debate in the House of Representatives, sarcastically asking if this harbor of Yankee democracy should be spared. The verdict was a resounding no. The British soldiers piled furniture and books, doused them with rocket powder, and set them ablaze. The magnificent Library of Congress, housed within the Capitol, was consumed by the flames. The seat of American democracy was torched. From there, they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to the president's house. They found the dinner table still set for 40 guests, a meal President Madison had expected to host in celebration of a victory that never came. The British officers, in a moment of supreme irony, sat down and feasted on the food and wine before them. After their meal, they too gathered furniture and set the executive mansion on fire. The flames lit up the night sky, visible for miles around. The destruction didn't stop there. The Treasury Building, the War Office, and other public buildings were also put to the torch. The goal was to systematically dismantle the symbols of American government. Admiral Cockburn personally oversaw the burning of the office of the National Intelligencer *, a newspaper that had been highly critical of him. This was not just a military act, it was personal. Why such brutality? The British justified it as retaliation for the American burning of York, the capital of Upper Canada, modern-day Toronto, a year earlier. They saw it as a necessary and just punishment. For the Americans, it was an act of pure vandalism that crossed a line. As the city burned, a bizarre turn of events occurred. A massive thunderstorm, possibly a hurricane, rolled into Washington. The torrential rain helped to extinguish many of the flames, saving what was left of the city. The storm was so violent that it also caused casualties among the British troops, with strong winds blowing down buildings and even lifting cannons off the ground. A tornado reportedly touched down, adding to the chaos. Mother Nature, it seemed, had intervened. After just 26 hours in the city, the British, wary of being trapped by a recovering American force and battered by the storm, decided to withdraw. They left behind a scene of utter devastation. The White House was a blackened, hollowed-out shell. The Capitol was a ruin. The young nation's capital was a smoldering symbol of humiliation. News of the burning spread, but it didn't have the effect the British intended. Instead of crushing American morale, it ignited a fire of a different kind. It created a sense of national unity and resolve that had been lacking throughout the war. The sight of their capital in ashes outraged Americans and stiffened their will to fight. The act was seen not as a legitimate act of war, but as a barbaric attack on their national honor. In the aftermath, there were even calls to move the capital to a more defensible location inland. But Congress, determined to show the nation's resilience, voted to stay and rebuild. The president's house would be reconstructed and painted white to cover the smoke stains, cementing its name as the White House. Thomas Jefferson would sell his personal library to Congress to replace the one that was lost, forming the nucleus of the modern Library of Congress. The burning of Washington was a low point, but it also became a turning point. It fueled a new sense of American nationalism and the determination to see the war through to its end. The humiliation would soon be answered with a stunning victory, which we will cover in our next chapter, the Battle of Baltimore and the birth of a national anthem. Thanks for watching. If you found this chapter of American history fascinating, please give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next part of our story. We'll see you in the next video. After the burning of Washington, the British set their sights on a new prize, the bustling port city of Baltimore, Maryland. For the Americans, still reeling from the humiliation of their capital in flames, this was it. This was the line in the sand. If Baltimore fell, the war, and perhaps the young nation itself, might be lost. The British plan was a classic pincer movement. Major General Robert Ross, the same commander who had marched through Washington, would land his veteran troops at North Point and advance on the city by land. Simultaneously, Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane's powerful Royal Navy fleet would sail up the Patapsco River and obliterate the city's defenses from the water. It was a strategy that had worked before, and the British were confident it would work again. Baltimore, however, was not Washington. Its citizens, a mix of merchants, sailors, and hardened privateers, were fiercely independent and ready for a fight. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, digging trenches, building earthworks, and rallying thousands of militia under the command of Major General Samuel Smith. Unlike the disorganized defense of Washington, Baltimore was a hornet's nest, and the British were about to kick it. As Ross's troops marched inland, they were met not by a panicked retreat, but by a determined American force. In the skirmish that followed, a shot rang out from the American lines, fired by two young militiamen. General Ross, the victor of Washington, fell from his horse, mortally wounded. The loss of their commander was a devastating blow to the British morale. But their professional army, now under Colonel Arthur Brooke, pushed on. The Battle of North Point was fierce. The American militia, though outnumbered, held their ground with surprising tenacity, buying precious time for the main defenses at Baltimore to be fully manned. They eventually made a strategic withdrawal, but they had bloodied the British nose and, more importantly, proven they would not be easily broken. The British advance slowed to a crawl as they approached the heavily fortified Hampstead Hill, the main line of defense for the city. Seeing the mile-long earthworks bristling with cannons and over 10,000 determined defenders, Colonel Brooke hesitated. An assault would be a bloodbath. He decided to wait for the Navy to do its part. All eyes now turned to the water, to the star-shaped fort guarding the entrance to Baltimore's harbor, Fort McHenry. This was the key. Admiral Cochrane believed he could reduce the fort to rubble in a matter of hours. If Fort McHenry fell, his ships could sail into the harbor unopposed and level the city with their cannons, forcing the army on Hampstead Hill to surrender. Inside the fort, about 1,000 American soldiers, commanded by Major George Armistead, braced for the storm. Armistead had recently commissioned a massive American flag, a flag so large that, as he said, the British will have no difficulty in seeing it from a distance. That flag was about to become a legend. On the morning of September 13, 1814, the bombardment began. The British fleet, anchored safely out of range of the fort's smaller cannons, unleashed a relentless barrage. For the next 25 hours, over 1,500 bombshells, rockets, and cannonballs rained down on Fort McHenry. The noise was deafening, the explosions shaking the very ground. The sky was filled with smoke and fire, a terrifying spectacle of destruction. Watching this hellish scene from a small American truce ship anchored among the British fleet was a 35-year-old lawyer from Georgetown named Francis Scott Key. Key was on a mission to negotiate the release of an American prisoner. He had been successful, but the British, not wanting him to reveal their attack plans, detained him aboard his own vessel. He was now a helpless spectator to the assault on his country. Through the long day and into the night, Key paced the deck, his heart filled with dread. He watched the red glare of the rockets and the bright flash of the bombs bursting over the fort. Every explosion sent a jolt of fear through him. Was the fort still standing? Were his countrymen still alive? As a fierce rainstorm swept in, the bombardment only intensified. The smoke and rain often obscured the view, leaving Key and his companions in agonizing suspense. All they could do was watch and pray. As the night wore on, the explosions suddenly stopped. An eerie, terrifying silence fell over the harbor. What did it mean? Had the fort finally surrendered? Had the flag been struck? In the darkness, Key could see nothing. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. He stared into the blackness, his mind racing with the worst possible scenarios. The fate of Baltimore, and perhaps the nation, hung in that silent, preyed-on darkness. Then, as the first faint light of dawn began to break on September 14th, a sight emerged through the mist and smoke. There, still flying defiantly over the battered walls of Fort McHenry, was the giant American flag. It was tattered and torn, but it was still there. Major Armistead's men had held, the fort had not fallen. Baltimore was saved. Overwhelmed with emotion, relief, pride, and patriotic fervor, Francis Scott Key began to scribble down verses on the back of a letter he had in his pocket. He wrote of the perilous fight, the rocket's red glare, and the bombs bursting in air. He wrote of the proof through the night that their flag was still there. He had just penned the lyrics to a song that would become the national anthem of the United States. The Star-Spangled Banner. The defense of Baltimore was more than just a military victory. It was a moment of profound national inspiration, captured forever in the words of a lawyer who watched from the water. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this chapter of history as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. We'll see you then. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through history. When we last left off, Francis Scott Key, a lawyer on a mission of mercy, was trapped aboard a British ship, forced to watch the bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore. All through the night of September 13, 1814, the sky exploded in a terrifying display of firepower. The British Royal Navy, the most powerful in the world, was throwing everything it had at the small American fort. For Key, and for the soldiers inside, it was a night of immense anxiety and uncertainty. Each rocket's red glare, each bomb bursting in air, was a question. Would the fort hold? Would the young nation's flag and the ideals it represented endure the onslaught? As the bombardment continued, hour after agonizing hour, the smoke and rain often obscured the view. He could only catch fleeting glimpses of the fort's massive garrison flag, a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. The defenders of Fort McHenry, a mix of regular soldiers and citizen militia, were equally uncertain. They hunkered down, enduring the constant shelling, their resolve tested with every explosion that shook the very ground beneath them. Their commander, Major George Armistead, had commissioned this specific flag to be so large that the British would have no trouble seeing it from a distance. It was a bold statement, and now that statement was being put to the ultimate test. The fate of Baltimore, and perhaps the entire war, seemed to hang in the balance, suspended in the smoky, violent night. The shelling finally ceased in the early morning hours of September 14th. An eerie silence fell over the harbor, a silence even more nerve-wracking than the previous night's chaos. As the first faint light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Key strained his eyes, peering through the mist and smoke. What would he see? Would it be the British Union Jack flying over a captured fort, signaling a devastating American defeat? Or would the symbol of their young republic still be there? The tension was unbearable. His heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of hope against a backdrop of fear. Everything depended on what the dawn's early light would reveal. And then he saw it. Through the clearing smoke, tattered but resolute, the American flag was still there. It waved, almost miraculously, over the ramparts of Fort Mc. The fort had not fallen. The defenders had held. An overwhelming wave of relief, pride, and patriotic fervor washed over Francis Scott Key. He was so moved by the sight, so overcome with emotion, that he began to search for something to write on. He found an envelope in his pocket and started jotting down verses, capturing the dramatic scenes he had just witnessed. He wrote of the perilous fight, the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, and the profound question of the night. Oh, say, does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave? The sight of the flag that morning wasn't just a military victory. It was a profound, emotional, and symbolic one. For Key, it represented the resilience of his country, the courage of its defenders, and the endurance of the American experiment itself. He saw in that flag a promise that had survived a trial by fire. The poem he began writing on the back of that letter would be his attempt to distill this powerful moment into words, to share the mix of terror and triumph that he felt. He wasn't thinking about creating a national anthem. He was simply a citizen, an eyewitness to history, trying to make sense of an extraordinary event and express the depth of his feelings. The words poured out of him, a testament to the enduring spirit he saw embodied in that flag. Once back on shore in Baltimore, Key finished his poem, which he titled Defense of Fort Monroe. He showed it to his brother-in-law, who recognized its power and had it printed on handbills that were quickly distributed throughout the city. The poem was an instant success. Baltimore was ecstatic with its victory, and Key's words perfectly captured the city's mood of relief and patriotic pride. Someone soon realized that the poem's meter fit a popular tune of the day, a British song called To Anacreon. In heaven, the pairing of Key's stirring words with this familiar melody was electric. The new song, now called the Star-Spangled Banner, spread like wildfire. It was sung in taverns, at public gatherings, and at patriotic celebrations. It became a powerful expression of American identity, born directly from a moment of national crisis. The song wasn't just about a flag, it was about what the flag stood for. Perseverance in the face of adversity, the courage of ordinary people defending their homes, and the idea that the nation, though young and tested, would endure. The story of its creation: a lawyer, on a ship, a night of terror, a dawn of hope, added to its mythic quality. It was a song forged in the heat of battle, a piece of art born from the smoke and fire of war, capturing a pivotal moment when the nation's future seemed uncertain. Over the decades, the song's popularity grew. The U.S. military began using it for official ceremonies, and by the late 19th century, it was widely regarded as the de facto national anthem. However, it wasn't until 1931, more than a century after the Battle of Baltimore, that Congress officially designated the Star-Spangled Banner as the national anthem of the United States. From a poem scribbled on the back of a letter, it had become the song that would represent the nation on the world stage, sung at sporting events, presidential inaugurations, and moments of both national celebration and mourning. And so, the story of the Star-Spangled Banner is a story of resilience. It's the story of a small fort that withstood a massive naval bombardment. It's the story of a young nation that proved it could defend itself. And it's the story of how a single moment of profound inspiration, witnessed by one man in the early light of dawn, could give birth to a song that would echo through generations, forever reminding Americans of the perilous fight and the enduring symbol that still waved. Or the land of the free and the home of the brave. It's a powerful legacy from a war that shaped a nation. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of our nation is filled with moments like these, where art and history intersect in beautiful ways. If you found this story as moving as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. We love having you here as we explore the past together. Until next time, take care. While the war raged in the north and on the high seas, a new, brutal front was opening in the American South, and a figure was rising who would change the course of American history. Down in the Gulf region, the conflict wasn't just about British redcoats. It was a complex and violent struggle involving American settlers, powerful Native American confederacies, and the ever-present British and Spanish forces vying for influence. This volatile mix was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and it would produce one of the most formidable and controversial leaders America had ever seen, Andrew Jackson. At the time, Jackson was a tough, ambitious lawyer and land speculator from Tennessee, a major general in the state militia, but not yet a national name. He was known for his fiery temper and an unyielding will. The war in the South truly ignited with the Creek War, a civil war within the Creek Nation between the Red Sticks, who were inspired by Tecumseh and opposed American expansion, and those who sought to coexist with the United States. When the Red Sticks attacked Fort Mims in what is now Alabama, a wave of panic and calls for revenge swept through the frontier. Tennessee answered the call, and Andrew Jackson was placed in command. Leading a force of determined but often unruly militiamen, Jackson marched into Creek territory. He was a relentless commander. He drove his men hard, sometimes through near starvation and mutiny, but he shared their hardships and led from the front. His leadership style was unforgiving but effective. He demanded absolute obedience and was known to execute soldiers for desertion. Yet he also inspired incredible loyalty in those who followed him. He wasn't just fighting an enemy, he was forging an army in the crucible of the unforgiving southern wilderness. The climax of the Creek War came at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March 1814. Here, Jackson, aided by allied Creek and Cherokee warriors, launched a decisive assault on the main Red Stick stronghold. The fighting was ferocious, and the outcome was a crushing defeat for the Red Sticks, effectively breaking their power. Jackson's victory was total and brutal, and it cemented his reputation as a fierce Indian fighter. He then imposed the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which forced the Creek Nation, including those who had fought alongside him, to cede over 23 million acres of land, nearly half their territory, to the United States. This massive land seizure opened up vast tracts for cotton cultivation and settlement, accelerating the westward expansion that would define the coming decades. With the Creek threat neutralized, Jackson's focus shifted to the British. He learned that British forces were operating out of Spanish-held Pensacola, Florida, arming and training remaining Red Stick warriors and preparing for an invasion of the Gulf Coast. In a bold and controversial move, acting without direct orders from Washington, Jackson invaded Spanish Florida and captured Pensacola in November 1814. He drove the British out, securing his rear flank before turning his attention to the main prize the British were after, the vital port city of New Orleans. The British plan was ambitious. Seize New Orleans, control the mouth of the Mississippi River, and potentially sever the American West from the rest of the country. They assembled a massive invasion force of over 8,000 veteran soldiers, many of whom had fought against Napoleon in Europe. To defend the city, Jackson had a much smaller, hodgepodge force. He had his Tennessee and Kentucky militiamen, U.S. Army regulars, local Creole volunteers, free men of color, and even a group of pirates led by the famous Jean Lafitte, whom Jackson had initially scorned but now desperately needed. It was a motley crew united only by their determined commander. Jackson declared martial law in New Orleans and set about constructing a formidable defensive line along the Rodriguez Canal, south of the city. He famously told the nervous citizens, "The enemy shall never enter your city." When the main British assault came on January 8, 1815, it was a disaster for the attackers. Jackson's well-protected riflemen and artillery crews unleashed a devastating storm of fire upon the advancing British columns, who were marching across an open field. The battle was shockingly one-sided. In less than an hour, the British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including their commanding general, Sir Edward Pakenham. American casualties were astonishingly light, with some reports claiming fewer than The Battle of New Orleans was an astounding victory. It was a massive morale boost for the United States and catapulted Andrew Jackson to the status of a national hero, second only to George Washington. The irony, of course, is that the battle was fought after the war had officially ended. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed in Belgium 2 weeks earlier, but news had not yet crossed the Atlantic. Nevertheless, the victory had a profound psychological impact. It made Americans feel like they had truly won the war, ending it on a high note of triumph and vindicating their national honor. Andrew Jackson, the tough frontiersman from Tennessee, was now Old Hickory, the hero of New Orleans, and his path to the White House was set. His actions in the South fundamentally reshaped the region and set the stage for the next era of American politics. Thank you so much for watching. The story of the War of 1812 is filled with these incredible moments that shaped the nation. If you found this chapter interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. We'd love to have you join our community. See you in the next video. Welcome back, history buffs. We're diving into one of the most incredible, improbable, and downright legendary battles in American history, the Battle of New Orleans. Picture this. It's January 1815. The War of 1812 has been a grueling back-and-forth struggle. The British have burned Washington, D.C. The American economy is reeling, and morale is at a low point. All eyes turn south to the vital port city of New Orleans, the gateway to the Mississippi River and the entire American interior. The British, fresh from their victories over Napoleon in Europe, are sending a massive, battle-hardened force to seize it. They are confident, professional, and arguably the most powerful military on the planet. Who could possibly stand in their way? Enter Andrew Jackson. He's tough, he's fiery, and he's just been tasked with defending the city. But when he arrives, he finds a city in a state of panic and disarray. He doesn't have a gleaming, professional army. Far from it. What he has is a motley crew, a true melting pot of defenders. We're talking U.S. Army regulars, of course, but also Kentucky and Tennessee militiamen frontiersmen, who were more at home with a long rifle than a military drill. He had local Creole militias, proud residents, defending their homes. He had free men of color, who formed their own dedicated battalions. He even had the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte and his band of buccaneers, who Jackson initially called hellish banditti, but soon realized he desperately needed for their artillery expertise and smuggled gunpowder. This wasn't an army. It was a patchwork quilt of defiance. It was Jackson's incredible challenge to stitch them all together into a cohesive fighting force before the British hammer fell. The British commander, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, was a respected and experienced officer. He was brother-in-law to the Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon. Pakenham brought with him over 8,000 veteran soldiers, men who had faced the best of France and won. As they advanced on New Orleans, they saw Jackson's forces and likely scoffed. How could this ragtag collection of farmers, pirates, and shopkeepers possibly stand up to the disciplined redcoats of the British Empire? Pakenham's plan was complex but decisive. A multi-pronged attack designed to overwhelm the American defenses and seize the city. The main thrust would be a frontal assault against Jackson's primary defensive line. Jackson, however, was a brilliant defensive strategist. He knew he couldn't beat the British in an open field battle. His strength lay in his terrain and his people. He established his main defensive position along the Rodriguez Canal, an old 10-foot-wide drainage ditch. He ordered his men to dig in, creating a massive earthen rampart that stretched from the Mississippi River on one side to an impassable cypress swamp on the other. This embankment, which came to be known as Line Jackson, was a kill zone. It was a muddy, formidable barrier, and behind it, Jackson strategically placed his artillery, including the cannons provided by Lafitte's pirates. He had created a bottleneck. The British had no choice but to come straight at him. The stage was set for a dramatic and bloody confrontation on the plains of Chalmette on the cold, foggy morning of January 8, 1815. The British advance began. The red-coated columns marched forward with parade ground precision, bayonets gleaming, drums beating a steady rhythm. It was a terrifyingly impressive sight, designed to intimidate and break the will of the defenders. But as they emerged from the morning mist, they entered the kill box Jackson had so masterfully prepared. The American riflemen and militiamen, protected behind their earthen wall, waited patiently. These were frontiersmen who could hit a squirrel in the eye from 100 yards. They were told not to fire until the British were well within range. "Hold your fire." The orders rang out. Hold, ... hold, ... fire. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The American line exploded in a devastating volley of rifle, musket, and cannon fire. The disciplined British lines, so effective in European warfare, were torn to shreds. The open field offered them no cover. The frontiersmen's long rifles were far more accurate than the standard British muskets, and they picked off officers and soldiers with chilling efficiency. The British soldiers showed incredible bravery, closing ranks and continuing to advance into the storm of lead. But it was hopeless. General Pakenham himself rode forward to rally his men and was struck down. His second-in-command was also killed, and his third-in-command severely wounded. Within less than an hour, the main British assault had completely disintegrated. The proud veterans of the Napoleonic Wars were in a state of shock, retreating in chaos, leaving behind a field littered with their dead and wounded. The numbers tell the shocking story. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including nearly 300 killed. The American losses. In a stunning contrast, Jackson reported just 13 men killed. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. The ragtag army of misfits had not just defeated the mighty British Empire, they had utterly annihilated their attacking force. News of the victory electrified the nation. After years of frustrating setbacks, America had a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. Andrew Jackson was instantly catapulted to the status of a national hero, a symbol of American grit and resilience. The Battle of New Orleans became a source of immense national pride, proving that the young republic could stand up to the greatest power on earth and win. It fostered a new sense of American identity and unity. But here is the great, poignant, and almost unbelievable irony of the entire event. The Battle of New Orleans, this defining moment of the War of 1812, was fought completely unnecessarily. 2 weeks earlier, on Christmas Eve of 1814, American and British diplomats in Europe had signed the Treaty of Ghent, officially ending the war. But in the age of sail, news traveled at a snail's pace. The message that peace had been declared was slowly making its way across the Atlantic Ocean, while soldiers were still fighting and dying in Louisiana. By the time the news of the treaty finally reached the United States, the celebration over Jackson's victory was already in full swing. So, does that mean the battle was meaningless? Absolutely not. While it didn't affect the outcome of the war on paper, its psychological and political impact was immense. The victory ensured that the British would honor the terms of the treaty without any further argument. More importantly, it gave the United States a sense of having won the war, even though the treaty itself simply restored the pre-war status quo. It ended the war on a high note, washing away the bitter taste of earlier defeats and humiliations. It launched the political career of Andrew Jackson, who would ride his wave of popularity all the way to the presidency. And it cemented a new, powerful sense of American nationalism that would define the decades to come. The Battle of New Orleans stands as a powerful testament to the idea that sometimes the most significant victories are not just about changing borders, but about changing hearts and minds and forging the spirit of a nation. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey back to 1815. It is a story that never fails to amaze. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter in history. We'll see you next time. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the War of 1812. We've journeyed through fiery naval battles, marched across vast territories, and witnessed the burning of capital. Now, we arrive at the closing chapter of this dramatic conflict, the Treaty of Ghent. How did this war, which had seen so much bloodshed and ambition, ultimately conclude? The answer, as we'll discover, is both surprising and profoundly significant for the future of the United States. By late 1814, both Great Britain and the United States were feeling the immense strain of a protracted war. Britain, having finally defeated Napoleon in Europe, was weary of conflict. The British public and treasury were exhausted. Pouring more resources into a secondary war across the Atlantic seemed less and less appealing, especially when the primary goal stopping American trade with Napoleonic France was now irrelevant. On the American side, the initial patriotic fervor had been tempered by the harsh realities of war. The U.S. Treasury was empty, the national bank's charter had expired, and the country was deeply divided politically, with New England Federalists even discussing secession at the Hartford Convention. The initial dreams of conquering Canada had evaporated, replaced by a desperate fight to defend their own borders. Both sides were ready for peace. Delegates from both nations converged on the neutral city of Ghent, in what is now Belgium. The American team was a powerhouse of political talent, including future President John Quincy Adams, the skilled orator Henry Clay, and Albert Gallatin, the former Secretary of the Treasury. The British delegation, while perhaps less star-studded, was composed of experienced diplomats. The negotiations, which began in August 1814, were anything but smooth. They were a tense, frustrating, and drawn-out affair, stretching on for months. Initially, both sides came to the table with ambitious demands. The British, emboldened by their recent victories in Europe and the burning of Washington, D.C., made some startling proposals. They demanded the creation of a massive, independent, Native American buffer state in the Old Northwest covering large parts of modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. This state would serve as a permanent barrier to American westward expansion. They also demanded significant territorial concessions along the Canadian border, including parts of Maine and control over the Great Lakes. The American delegates were aghast. John Quincy Adams famously declared that they would not give up a single inch of territory. To them, these demands felt like a denial of American sovereignty, a rollback of the very independence they had fought for in the Revolution. For a time, it seemed the talks would collapse entirely, and the war would rage on. But as the autumn of 1814 wore on, the situation began to shift. American victories at Plattsburgh and Baltimore demonstrated that the United States was far from defeated. The Duke of Wellington, Britain's greatest military hero, was asked for his opinion. He bluntly advised the British government that without total control of the Great Lakes, they had no grounds to demand territorial concessions. He was unwilling to take command in America to achieve a victory that he saw as difficult and costly. This sober assessment, combined with growing pressure from British merchants and taxpayers to end the war, led the British government to soften its stance. They decided to drop their most extreme demands, including the creation of the Indian buffer state. This was a critical turning point. It signaled a major betrayal of their Native American allies, who had fought alongside them, but it opened the door to a realistic peace. With the major sticking points removed, the negotiators could finally get down to the business of ending the war. The final treaty, signed on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1814, is a remarkable document, mostly for what it doesn't say. it didn't resolve any of the core issues that had supposedly caused the war in the first place. There was no mention of the impressment of American sailors, no discussion of neutral trading rights or maritime blockades. Why? Because with Napoleon defeated, these issues had largely become moot. The Royal Navy no longer needed to impress sailors on such a massive scale, and the blockades of Europe were over. Instead, the Treaty of Ghent was essentially an agreement to stop fighting and return to the way things were before the war started. The official term for this is status quo ante bellum, the state existing before the war. All conquered territory was to be returned. Forts captured by the British in the West would be handed back to the Americans. Lands captured by the Americans in Canada would be returned to the British. No borders were changed. No money was exchanged. No one was declared the winner. On paper, the War of 1812 ended in a complete and total stalemate, a draw. But here's where the story gets its final, ironic twist. News in the early 19th century traveled at the speed of a sailing ship. The treaty signed in Europe on Christmas Eve would not reach American shores for several weeks. In that communication gap, one of the most famous and lopsided battles of the war was fought. On January 8, 1815, General Andrew Jackson, leading a motley crew of Army regulars, militia, pirates, and volunteers, decisively defeated a veteran British force at the Battle of New Orleans. It was a stunning American victory, a source of immense national pride. And technically, it was fought after the peace treaty had already been signed. The battle had absolutely no impact on the outcome of the war or the terms of the treaty. However, the psychological impact was enormous. The news of Jackson's incredible victory reached the American public at roughly the same time as the news of the peace treaty. For many Americans, the two events became fused in their minds. It didn't feel like a draw. It felt like they had fought the British to a standstill and then crushed them in a glorious final battle, forcing them to sign a peace treaty. The war that had begun with embarrassing failures and divisions ended, in the popular imagination, with a spectacular triumph. So, while the Treaty of Ghent officially declared the war a stalemate, its legacy was anything but. For the United States, the outcome was transformative. The war, often called the Second War of American Independence, served to reaffirm the nation's sovereignty. It proved that the young republic could and would defend itself against a global superpower. The sense of national unity and purpose that emerged from the war's end kick-started a period known as the Era of Good Feelings. The Federalist Party, tainted by its opposition to the war, collapsed, leaving a one-party political landscape for a time. A new generation of national heroes, like Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, was created. The war also broke the power of Native American confederacies in the Northwest and the South, tragically opening the floodgates for relentless American expansion westward in the decades to come. Economically, the British blockade had forced the U.S. to develop its own manufacturing capabilities, stimulating industrial growth. In essence, the war, despite its inconclusive end on paper, reshaped America's identity, politics, and economy. It fostered a new, robust sense of American nationalism and pride. The United States had not gained any land from the Treaty of Ghent, but it had gained a renewed confidence in its own destiny. The stalemate on paper was a profound victory in spirit. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the War of 1812 and the Treaty of Ghent. It's a fascinating example of how the perception of an event can be just as powerful as its reality. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more pivotal moments in history, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our deep dive into the War of 1812. Today, we're exploring the final chapter, the aftermath and the powerful legacy it left behind. If you've been with us through the battles and the burning of Washington, you'll want to see how it all concludes. What happens after the smoke clears? Well, something remarkable. The War of 1812, often called the Second War of American Independence, didn't result in massive territorial gains or crushing defeats for either side. Instead, its most significant outcome was internal. It forged a new, unified American identity. Think about it. Before the war, the United States was still a fractious collection of states, often with competing interests. The shared struggle against a global superpower created a powerful sense of national spirit and patriotism that had truly existed before. Suddenly, people from Georgia to Massachusetts felt a common bond. They weren't just Virginians or New Yorkers anymore. They were Americans, united under one flag. This newfound unity had tangible effects. One of the most critical was the boost to American manufacturing. Before the war, the U.S. was heavily reliant on British imports. But when the British blockade cut off trade, Americans had to get creative. They started building their own factories to produce textiles, iron, and other essential goods. This wasn't just a temporary fix. It was the spark that ignited America's industrial revolution. The nation began a slow but steady shift from a purely agrarian economy to a manufacturing powerhouse. This economic independence was just as important as the political independence won decades earlier. The war forced America to stand on its own 2 feet, not just militarily, but economically as well. Simultaneously, the war helped to finally stabilize the nation's borders. In the north, the Treaty of Ghent solidified the border with British Canada, leading to over 2 centuries of peace between the two nations. In the south, the conflict broke the power of several Native American confederacies that had allied with the British. This, along with Andrew Jackson's campaigns, paved the way for American expansion into Florida and the Deep South. While this expansion came at a great cost to Native American populations, from the perspective of the young United States, it secured its frontiers and removed significant obstacles to its westward growth. The map of America began to look much more like the one we know today. And what's a war without heroes? The War of 1812 created a new generation of them, figures who would shape the nation for decades. Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, became a national icon, his fame eventually catapulting him to the presidency. William Henry Harrison, another future president, earned his reputation at the Battle of the Thames. These weren't just generals. They were symbols of American courage and resilience. Their stories filled newspapers and became the stuff of legend, inspiring a sense of national pride and a belief that Americans could hold their own against anyone. This era of good feelings, this surge in patriotism, was directly tied to the heroes and victories of the war. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the War of 1812 was its effect on America's international standing. Before 1812, European powers, especially Great Britain, often treated the United States with a degree of condescension. They impressed its sailors, interfered with its trade, and generally didn't see the young republic as an equal. By fighting the world's greatest naval power to a standstill, the United States proved it had the will and the ability to defend its interests and its sovereignty. After the Treaty of Ghent, the era of being pushed around was over. European nations began to treat the United States with a new level of respect. It was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a legitimate, permanent, and rising power on the world stage. So, in the end, the War of 1812 wasn't about winning land or conquering enemies. It was about winning respect both from other nations and, more importantly, from itself. The war united the American people, kick-started its industrial engine, secured its borders, and announced its arrival as a serious player in global affairs. It was the fiery crucible in which a collection of states was truly forged into a nation. This renewed spirit and confidence would propel the United States through a century of incredible growth, expansion, and transformation. The echoes of the cannons from 1812 would resonate for generations, shaping the very identity of the country. And that concludes our series on the War of 1812. From the maritime grievances that started it all to the lasting legacy of a unified nation, it was a pivotal, if often overlooked, conflict in American history. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this series and want to see more deep dives into history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We have a lot more history to uncover together. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into the meteoric rise of one of America's most polarizing figures, Andrew Jackson. How did a man from the rugged frontier, a figure often described as rough and tumble, ascend to the highest office in the land? The story really kicks into high gear with a single, spectacular event: the Battle of New Orleans. Picture this. It's January 1815. The War of 1812 is technically. Treaty of Ghent had been signed weeks earlier, but news travels slowly back then. A formidable British force, seasoned veterans from the Napoleonic Wars, is descending upon New Orleans. They're confident, professional, and ready to seize control of the Mississippi River. Defending the city is a motley crew led by Major General Andrew Jackson. His army isn't a polished fighting force. It's a patchwork quilt of regular soldiers, frontier militia from Tennessee and Kentucky, local volunteers, free African Americans, and even a group of pirates led by Jean Lafitte. On paper, it looked like a disaster waiting to happen. The British commanders expected an easy victory against this ragtag American assembly. They launched a full frontal assault, marching in neat, disciplined lines across an open field. But Jackson was a brilliant, if unconventional, tactician. He had his men dig in behind a series of earthworks, the Line Jackson. When the British advanced, they walked into a slaughterhouse. The American riflemen and artillery, protected by their fortifications, unleashed a devastating and accurate wall of fire. The British lines crumpled. The attack was a catastrophic failure for them, with over 2,000 casualties, including their top commanding generals. The Americans, they suffered fewer than 100. The news of this stunning, lopsided victory electrified the nation. In an era before instant communication, the story spread like wildfire through newspapers and word of mouth. It was a David versus Goliath tale, and Andrew Jackson was David. The Battle of New Orleans, though fought after the peace treaty was signed, had an immense psychological impact. The War of 1812 had been a tough, often humiliating conflict for the United States. Washington, D.C. had been burned, and national morale was low. This victory, this incredible, defiant stand, felt like a vindication. It was the shot in the arm the young country desperately needed. And at the center of it all was Andrew Jackson. Overnight, he became more than just a general. He became a national icon. Old Hickory. They called him, a nickname that perfectly captured his tough, unyielding, frontier spirit. He was seen as the embodiment of American courage, resilience, and a new, assertive brand of nationalism. He wasn't one of the polished, aristocratic founding fathers from Virginia or math. He was a man of the people, a product of the West, a symbol of the expanding, democratic spirit of the age. This newfound fame became political dynamite. Jackson's name was on everyone's lips. He was the hero who had saved New Orleans, the man who had stood up to the British Empire and won. His military exploits in the years that followed, particularly his controversial campaigns against Native American tribes in the South, only added to his reputation as a decisive and forceful leader loved by his supporters, feared by his enemies. His popularity wasn't based on complex political theories or long legislative careers. It was built on action, on victory, on a persona that resonated deeply with the common man. This immense popularity set the stage for his political career. The traditional political establishment, the Virginia dynasty, and the New England elites suddenly had a serious challenger from an unexpected quarter. Jackson's supporters saw him as a reformer, someone who would sweep away the corrupt insider politics of Washington, D.C. and restore the government to the people. His opponents, however, saw him as a dangerous, aspiring tyrant, a military chieftain who had little respect for the law or the Constitution. The presidential election of 1824 was a turning point. It was a chaotic, four-way race, and Jackson won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes. But because no candidate won an outright majority, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. There, a political deal, which Jackson's supporters furiously labeled the corrupt bargain, led to John Quincy Adams becoming president. This perceived injustice only fueled Jackson's popularity. To his followers, it was proof that the system was rigged by the elites against the will of the people. This set the stage for a political revolution. For the next 4 years, the Jacksonian movement organized, mobilized, and campaigned relentlessly. They built a powerful political machine, creating a new party, the Democratic Party, around the personality and appeal of Andrew Jackson. They portrayed the 1828 election as a stark choice. It was the people versus the aristocracy, Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. And this time, the result was undeniable. Jackson won in a landslide, carried to victory by an unprecedented wave of popular support from farmers, frontiersmen, and working-class voters across the country. His victory wasn't just a change in administration, it marked the beginning of a new era in American politics, often called the Age of Jackson. His fame, born on the battlefield of New Orleans, had carried him all the way to the presidency. He had transformed from a military hero into a powerful political symbol, representing the aspirations and resentments of a huge segment of the American population. His rise demonstrates the incredible power of a compelling personal story and the potent force of popular nationalism in shaping a nation's destiny. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this chapter of American history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about Jackson's rise. See you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we arrive at a pivotal moment, a turning point where a young nation, tested by fire, finally forges a new and lasting identity. We're diving into Chapter 20, a nation's new identity. Imagine the scene. The cannons have fallen silent. The smoke has cleared, and the ink has dried on the peace treaty. The War of 1812, a conflict that many feared would shatter the fragile American Republic, is over. But instead of division and despair, something remarkable happens. An unprecedented wave of unity and national pride sweeps across the country. Historians have a name for this unique period: the era of good feelings. For the first time, Political bickering seemed to fade into the background. The old party rivalries that had defined the nation's early years began to dissolve. A Boston newspaper, once a fierce critic of the administration, famously proclaimed the arrival of these good feelings during President James Monroe's goodwill tour across the nation. It was a time when being an American meant more than just living in a particular state or belonging to a certain political party. There was a shared sense of purpose, a collective sigh of relief, and a burgeoning confidence in the nation's future. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of celebration. It was a profound psychological shift. For decades, America had been viewed by the world, and even by some of its own citizens, as a fragile experiment. A daring, perhaps even foolish, attempt at self-government that could collapse at any moment. European powers watched with skepticism, waiting for the Republic to falter. The War of 1812 was the ultimate test. Could this young nation actually defend its sovereignty against the might of the British Empire for a second time? The answer was a resounding yes. By standing firm, by refusing to yield, America proved its resilience. It demonstrated that it wasn't a temporary arrangement, but a permanent fixture on the world stage. The narrative changed from, if the United States will survive, to how it will grow and prosper. The national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, born from the fires of the Battle of Baltimore, perfectly captured this new spirit. It was a song of endurance, of a flag that remained defiantly against all odds. This newfound confidence sparked a wave of westward expansion, economic growth, and cultural development. Americans began to look inward, focusing on building their own country, constructing roads, canals, and industries. A new generation of leaders, like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, emerged with bold visions for the nation's economy and infrastructure, what they called the American system. It was a plan to strengthen the nation from within, to make it economically self-sufficient, and knit the diverse regions together into a cohesive whole. Think about the journey we've taken. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 was a promise, a bold statement of intent. The Revolutionary War was the struggle to win that independence. But the War of 1812 was the moment that solidified it. It was the final, definitive act that confirmed America's place in the world. Independence, once won, was now defended and secured, seemingly forever. The nation had earned its stripes, both literally on the flag and figuratively in the eyes of the world. This era cemented the idea of an American identity separate from its European roots. Noah Webster was creating an American dictionary. Artists were painting American landscapes, and authors were writing American stories. The nation was not just a collection of former British colonies anymore. It was America, a single, unified nation with a proud past and an even more promising future. The fragile experiment was over. In its place stood a confident republic, ready to face the challenges of a new century and define its own destiny. The era of good feelings wouldn't last forever. Of course, new challenges and deep divisions, particularly over the issue of slavery, would soon emerge to test the nation's unity once again. But the foundation of national identity built during this period was crucial. It provided a bedrock of shared experience and pride that would be called upon in the turbulent decades to come. It was the moment America truly came of age. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of America's new identity. It's a fascinating chapter that reveals so much about the country's character. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue our journey through history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us create more content just like this. We'll see you in the next chapter. And so, the guns fell silent. across the ravaged landscapes, from the rolling hills of Pennsylvania to the humid bayous of Louisiana. An unfamiliar quiet began to settle. The thunder of cannons that had echoed for 4 long, brutal years faded into memory, replaced by the whisper of the wind through newly leafed trees and the distant, mournful call of a lone bird. The war was over. Peace, a concept that had become almost mythical, a distant dream whispered in letters home and prayed for in hushed tones, had finally returned. But this was not the same America that had entered the conflict. The nation had been torn asunder, brother against brother, and the scars ran deep, not just on the land, but in the hearts of its people. The return of peace was not a simple turning of a page, but the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. The cost had been staggering. More than 600,000 lives were lost. Families were shattered, and an entire way of life, built on a foundation of human bondage, was dismantled. The air was thick with grief, with loss, with the ghosts of what had been. Yet, amidst the sorrow and the ruin, something else was stirring, a nascent, fragile hope. This was not just the end of a war. It was the crucible in which the United States was The conflict has often been called America's Second Revolution, and for good reason. If the first revolution was about creating a nation, this second one was about defining it. It was a brutal, agonizing process of self-discovery, a fight over the very soul of the country. The questions that had plagued the founders, the compromises that had been kicked down the road for decades, had finally been answered, not in the hallowed halls of Congress, but on the bloody fields of Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. The debate over whether this was a collection of sovereign states or a single, indivisible union was settled. The stars and stripes, which had flown over a divided house, now represented one nation, united not by choice, but by the undeniable verdict of trial by fire. The proposition that all men are created equal, a promise made in 1776, began its long, arduous journey toward becoming a reality for millions who had been denied its most basic meaning. How did this young nation, barely 80 years old, survive such a cataclysm? How did it pull itself back from the brink of utter collapse? The answer lies in the resilience of the human spirit. It's found in the soldiers from both North and South, who returned home to the monumental task of rebuilding. They laid down their rifles and picked up hammers and plows. They were no longer Confederates or Federals. They were farmers, blacksmiths, fathers, and sons, faced with the shared challenge of piecing together a shattered world. They had to learn to live alongside men they had once tried to kill, to find a common purpose in the ash heaps of their former lives. Survival was also found in the halls of power, where leaders like Abraham Lincoln, with his vision of malice toward none, with charity for all, sought to bind up the nation's wounds. His assassination was a tragic blow, a cruel punctuation mark at the end of the conflict. But his spirit of reconciliation endured. The path of reconstruction that followed was fraught with immense difficulty, with setbacks, and with failures. The struggle for true equality and justice would continue for generations. And in many ways, it continues to this day. But the foundation for that ongoing struggle, the principle of a single, unified nation dedicated to liberty, had been secured. The survival of America can also be credited to the sheer will of its people. The women who had managed farms and factories, who had served as nurses on the front lines, who had held families together in the face of unimaginable loss. Their strength and fortitude were the silent, essential bedrock upon which the nation rested. It was in the newly freed African Americans who, after centuries of bondage, embraced their liberty with a profound sense of hope and determination. They built schools, churches, and communities, striving to make the promise of freedom a tangible reality for themselves and their children, despite the immense obstacles and prejudices that remained. Think of it. A generation that had known nothing but strife, that had witnessed the absolute worst of human nature, somehow found the capacity to look forward. They chose to build rather than to dwell in destruction. They chose to believe in the possibility of a shared future, even when the past was a landscape of pain. It was an extraordinary act of collective faith. They had looked into the abyss and, instead of succumbing to the darkness, they resolved to rebuild, to heal, to create a more perfect union from the wreckage. This second revolution affirmed that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, could indeed endure the greatest of internal tests. It proved that the ideals upon which America was founded were not mere rhetoric, but a powerful, resilient force capable of overcoming even the most profound divisions. The process was messy, imperfect, and stained with more blood than anyone could have ever imagined. But it was through this fiery ordeal that the nation was truly born anew, with a renewed, if painful, understanding of the price of liberty and the meaning of unity. And so, as we look back, we see not just the end of a war, but a profound transformation, a story of immense tragedy, but also of incredible strength. It is the story of how a young, fractured republic survived its darkest hour, how it confronted its original sin, and how, through unimaginable sacrifice, it reaffirmed its commitment to the great experiment of democracy. The echoes of that conflict still reverberate through our society, reminding us that the work of creating a just and unified nation is never truly finished. The peace that settled in 1865 was hard-won and precious. It was a peace that carried the weight of history and the hope of a future. As the nation began to heal, the quiet of the night was no longer a harbinger of attack, but a canvas for dreams. And on that canvas, under the silent, watchful gaze of the stars, the flag waved, not as a symbol of victory for one side over the other, but as a testament to the endurance of the whole, a symbol of a union tested and broken, but ultimately preserved. A promise that, even after the darkest of storms, the nation would endure, united and indivisible. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you found this reflection meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories from our shared past. Your support helps us continue to bring these important moments to life. Until next time, take care.